So our next talk is going to be Steve Tyler here. Taylor, sorry, Taylor. Who is going to give us an overview of the contributions of amateur astronomy to the general science of astronomy. So here is Steve.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to Mark and Jacob for inviting me along. I'm a member of the State College Astronomy Club, the Central Pennsylvania Observers, and I was the person that didn't manage to get out of actually appearing to do the lecture.
Louder.
Sorry. I was the only person that didn't manage to find something else to do tonight. Look at the audience. Central Pennsylvania Observers meets once a month in a local college where we get together for a talk, usually given by a member of the Penn State Astronomy Department. We also organise outreach activities in local parks for children and other interested adults. And we organise a very large star party at the Cherry Springs State Park in the north of Pennsylvania, which is one of the darkest sites on the eastern seaboard. Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about the contributions of amateurism to professional astronomy over the years and the activities that amateur astronomers are doing, making a contribution to the modern science of astronomy. It's interesting to note that the early pioneers of astronomy were almost all amateurs. There was no real professional astronomy activity in the world until probably the late 19th century. And a lot of the advances in early astronomy that we look at today were actually contributed by people that were not doing astronomy for profit, a bit like grad students. Starting out with Galileo. Galileo pioneered the use of the telescope as an astronomical instrument. Herschel, the discoverer of the planet Uranus, was actually a composer and musician, highly thought of by even people like Mozart, but making huge contributions to astronomy with his discovery of nebulae and creating first large mirror telescopes himself. He ground and figured his own mirrors, worked out how to do it, worked out where he was going wrong. Hale and Bopp. Everybody old enough to remember the Hale-Bopp comet in the 1990s. Both Hale and Bopp were amateur astronomers. Dr. Patrick Moore, and nearly everybody here must have read a book on astronomy or popularising astronomy by Patrick Moore. He probably brought more English astronomers into the science than any other contribution. He was also an amateur. He actually contributed a huge amount of work to the NASA Apollo program with his studies of the moon. We've just seen pictures of the 200-inch Palomar telescope in the quiz. The designer of that was another amateur astronomer. The granddaddy of telescope making in the USA was a chap called Albert Ingalls, who was the chief editor of the Scientific American for many, many years. And he proselytized the idea that anybody could join in the science of astronomy, anybody could make their own telescope. He was trying to lower the cost of access during the Depression in the 1930s, when there was no money. People got together in quite large clubs of individuals and made their own telescopes from scratch. Henry Draper, the first person to actually be curious enough to see what happened if you put a camera next to a telescope, another amateur. And one more name here, as I mentioned, a guy called Bill Bradfield, who died last year. Bill Bradfield found more comets than any other person solo in history. He actually found 22 comets over his career by his own absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of the night sky, and realising whenever he looked somewhere, that wasn't there last time I looked. And Tim introduced the telescope here on our left. Two major elements of this telescope. It's called a Dobsonian. The mounting system was invented by a chap called John Dobson. John lived most of his life in San Francisco, and he was a Hindu monk who wanted to look at the sky, and he was forbidden to look at the sky by the head of his monastery. So he made his own telescope in secret, and he ground his own mirror using beach sand, and he ground it in a bucket in a greenhouse in the gardens of the monastery, so that they couldn't hear him making the mirror. John was thrown out of the monastery for making that telescope, and he spent the rest of his career forming a very large group of astronomers in San Francisco called the Sidewalk Astronomers. And those guys would stand a telescope on a street corner somewhere in San Francisco and invite people to look at the moon or Jupiter or Saturn through the instruments that he made. So if many people here will have had, many people in the USA have had their first experience of telescopes through members of the Sidewalk Astronomers, and there are groups of Sidewalk Astronomers throughout the US and the rest of the world. What sorts of things are amateurs contributing to modern astronomy? Online, there are many things like the Zooniverse programs, and the Zooniverse programs uses effectively crowdsourcing, lots of people looking at lots of different images, and there are programs on Zooniverse for people to look at classifying variable stars. I think somebody mentioned that there was a preamble before talking about gravitational lensing, where thousands of photographs have been put online, and interested members of the public are invited to look at them and see if they can see signs of gravitational lenses. And a gravitational lens you could notice by a bright galaxy, possibly surrounded by two satellite galaxies, or even four satellite galaxies, as the gravity around the galaxy focuses the light of even more distant objects behind it. There are programs on galactic morphology. Well, that means characterizing the shapes of every galaxy that's been found, and seeing if there are patterns in the shapes and the volume of stars within a galaxy. People have been looking at Kepler data to look for the characteristic dips as an exoplanet transits across the face of a star. And there are even programs to look at the information from the LIGO program, the great new gravitational instrument. Nearly all astronomy clubs in the US and the world take great delight in enthusing astronomers for tomorrow, and provide grassroots support for school-aged children with Skywatch events over the year. But on a more direct basis, amateurs are involved in some pretty heavy science, with programs looking here at high-speed spectroscopy, following a supernova that might erupt tonight in the sky somewhere, and every available telescope in the world will try and capture the data from the telescope, the light data from the telescope, as the Earth rotates, and follow the first few moments of the death of a star. There are programs in photometry where we watch the slow variation in brightness of a star, and amateurs will often look at a single star for a research campaign for a professional observatory, where a professional observatory couldn't possibly devote enough time to doing that on a long-term basis. And an amateur program will watch a star for 24 hours a day for several weeks to plot a light curve. I've already mentioned comet and asteroid hunting. It's a favourite activity of amateurs, and that requires a really good telescope and a really good view of the sky. other programs recently have been looking at observing the transits of the moons of Jupiter over the face of Jupiter and against other stars. And amateurs have been looking for views of the very faint atmospheres around some of the moons. And one other thing that amateurs push in many cases, we are very, very passionate about the darkness of our skies and the loss of sky darkness to encroaching development and inappropriate street lighting. We've been very fortunate that the people around Cherry Springs State Park have been very careful to preserve that beautiful sky up there. This is a photograph taken in the 1970s at the Anglo-Australian Observatory. It's the Great Nebula in Orion, done by a gentleman called David Malin. It's one of the finest photographic representations I think ever made. But this picture is also of M42, the Great Nebula, and that was taken at Cherry Springs State Park last year by another CPO member. And I think you agree that there's a remarkable amount of detail even in that amateur image, with the faint clouds surrounding the trapezium star group there. It's a really pretty picture. Amateur equipment is now comparable in many ways to some of the professional stuff. Amateurs have built spectroscopes now with sufficiently sensitive to join in the hunt for exoplanets, not to copy the work of professionals, but to look for them on their own. Both by the Kepler method, which is to observe the dip in the light curve as the star as it passes the planet as it passes in front of the star, and also by radial velocity. The radial velocity method is when you observe the movement of the whole star backwards and forwards in the direction of view, caused by the interaction with a very massive exoplanet. Amateur spectroscopes. Spectroscopy used to be the preserve only of the professionals, but these days amateurs can fit spectroscopes like the unit shown there to quite a small telescope and again make contributions to professional study. Occultation. Occultation is a very strange hobby. It's for people that find observational astronomy far too exciting. It's a network of observers who take pictures of the night sky and wait for the stars to blink out. They take a cheap video camera, video capture card, and some method of recording the time, and they will sit outside for hours and wait for a star to flash out. From that information, you can see if an asteroid has passed in front of a star, and if enough people do it, they can work out what the shape of the asteroid or comet is. And this image that I've shown here shows the view of two little asteroids that have been mapped purely by occultation. And a huge network of observers all over the planet sit out there in the dark with a stopwatch and a camera and watch, just for a star to blink out. And if they're really lucky, another star will blink out that they weren't expecting. And then we've learned something new. So the contribution that amateurs have made, what are amateur clubs going to do? Well, amateur clubs are, if not dead, they are beginning to die. We're struggling to maintain relevance. We're struggling with age and gender profile. It's very, very hard to compete with the images from instruments like Hubble. And if you've ever looked through a real telescope, unless you're very enthusiastic, once you've seen one faint grey fuzzy blob, in many cases you've really seen them all. and you probably don't go out and do that again unless you're really dedicated. Central Pennsylvania observers would very much welcome the chance to collaborate in observing projects with Penn State, but we need a focus, to coin a phrase. We need to have some further relevance other than passively absorbing information. Right now, as I said, we do some local outreach, and we do host one of the best star parties in the country at Cherry Springs State Park. But I think we'd really like to move on to new things. Thank you very much.
Astronomers hunt for supernova. How can you tell it's a supernova and not just another star they didn't notice before?
Because it's extremely bright and it arises very, very suddenly. It's not something that you'd miss if it was present in something like a galaxy. You were looking there, all of a sudden you are looking at something whose light output is 100 or 1,000 times more even than a galaxy. So it's very, very apparent when one occurs.
So something that I've kind of argued with my friends about, and I've kind of like taught my intro astronomy classes about, is that when you look through a telescope and you look at some image of a galaxy, the images that we see on the screen are not necessarily what we see through the telescope. So I've always thought that the images that I see are just gray. We don't see the actual color. So as somebody that looks through a lot of telescopes through eyepieces, what is your experience with that?
My experience is the same with yours. I have never seen colour in this stellar object. The only thing I've ever seen colour in is M42. The Great Nebula in Orion. Yeah.
Any other questions?
So how do you join the Central Pennsylvania observers?
Come along to. Sorry? How do you join the Central Pennsylvania observers? Come along to our meetings at South Hills College, down near the YMCA, on the first Thursday of the month, and you'll be welcome.
And let's get one last round of applause for both of our speakers, Tim and Steve, for coming out.